I'm here. Thank you,
Great.
Mr. Chairman.
Great.
Thank you. So congratulations to all of our nominees. I want to talk about how this economic crisis has affected women and families. This year, women's workforce participation hit its lowest levels since 1988, and 26% of women who became unemployed this year said it was due to a lack of childcare. Mr. Harris, when you look at the data, do you agree that lack of childcare is one factor that is now holding our economy back?
I agree that, yes. I mean, I agree that lack of childcare was a massive concern prior to the pandemic. It is a continued concern after the pandemic. And women's labor force participation, as you mentioned, Senator, is a critical aspect to long-term growth. And without a solution, particularly on the supply side for childcare, on the affordability of childcare, I don't think we'll see the levels of participation that we need in order to see the levels of growth that we want.
Thank you, Mr. Harris. In fact, you are right when you refer to it was already a problem before the pandemic. You know, this year, the pandemic showed us what working families have always known. Childcare is critical infrastructure. And yet, for generations now, we have underinvested in our babies and we have left parents to just try to work it out on their own. Even before the pandemic, half of all Americans lived in childcare deserts, which are areas where there aren't enough licensed childcare slots for every child who needs one. And COVID only made this worse, as thousands of childcare providers have been forced to shut their doors. At the same time, childcare workers, mostly women and disproportionately women of color, are being paid poverty-level wages. So, Mr. Harris, let me ask you this. Do you support a robust federal investment in childcare to support families and to ensure that these caregiving jobs are good, middle-class, dependable jobs?
Senator, I do support a robust investment in childcare for a few reasons, including some of the ones I just mentioned. But it's not just about getting families and particularly female workers back in the labor market. It's also just about making lives easier for working families. It doesn't have to be so hard. You mentioned the workforce issue. I believe the typical wage, I mentioned this earlier in my testimony, the typical wage for a child care worker is $12.25. That's inconsistent with their value towards children, and it's inconsistent with what we know about investment in child care and long-run productivity. So I am absolutely supportive of such an effort.
Good. Well, thank you, Mr. Harris. I appreciate it. You know, I'm glad that President Biden has put this issue front and center, but we need enough federal funding to actually solve the problem, not just nibble around the edges on this. And that means $700 billion investment to raise the wages of every child care worker and guarantee affordable care for every family. We also need to provide enough high quality spots for every child. And that's why I'm introducing the Building Childcare for a Better Future Act this week with Chairman Wyden. This bill increases the child care entitlement to states to $10 billion a year. And it also creates a new $5 billion a year supply building program to help child care providers open, get licensed, train, and hire skilled staff, and provide high quality care. So let me ask you, Professor Batchelder, could we fund transformative investments in child care, the kind we're talking about here, simply by giving the IRS the resources to make sure that the wealthy and the giant corporations are paying the taxes that they actually already owe?
Yes, Senator. We could raise a large amount of revenue by reducing the tax gap and focusing that reduction on high net worth individuals and large corporations. The president has put forth a proposal that Treasury estimated would raise $700 billion in the first decade and $1.6 trillion in the following decade. And there are reasons to believe this might be an underestimate. It does not include the effects of upgrading IT systems or improving taxpayer services. And it also does not include the indirect effects of additional enforcement on voluntary compliance. There's a lot of evidence that people comply more when enforcement is improved, even if they aren't personally audited. And
Yep.
one statistic that amazed me in that report, and I had to write this down because there were so many zeros, was that only 0.00004% of partnerships are audited. So just to talk about one industry that I know, there are some large law firms with thousands of attorneys. Partners earn over $1 million a year. And I find it hard to believe, if one knows that your audit rate is 0.00004%, that would not affect voluntary compliance.
Well, thank you, Professor Batchelder. This is why yesterday I introduced the Restoring the IRS Act. This bill provides mandatory funding for the IRS to ensure that it has the resources it needs to go after wealthy tax cheats, including the partnerships that you mentioned. Together with my wealth tax and real corporate profits tax, we could raise trillions of dollars without increasing the taxes on 99.9% of Americans by a single penny. These three proposals together generate more than enough revenue to pay every cent of the Building Childcare for a Better Future Act, plus every cent of the investments in childcare in President Biden's American Jobs Plan and American Families Plan, and every cent of all the other critical investments in families and workers in those two plans combined. So let's not waste this historic opportunity to invest in American families. Thank you, Mr. Chair.